Okay. Where's my head at? Okay. Oh, right. I was going to go over here and see if I can turn this thermostat down. It's set, looks like it's set to like 23. And that feels too warm to me. Do I have power? Oh, yeah. Oof. Friends. No wonder the university's carbon footprint is so high. I don't know if that thing actually works. It might just be for show. Okay. So, I'll leave the door open for a minute in case people are running a little late. Okay, so welcome back to, I guess, the second of, I think, 10 classes of SOC 377. So this is Sociology of Youth. Is anybody, I guess, before we get started, you know, we covered sort of history of youth and childhood up until the 20th century last class. This class, we're going to delve into, looking at basically the last few generational cohorts. So the silents, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and then, of course, Gen Z. So we're going to get into that in a sec. Sorry, I'm still feeling a little bit under the weather, so I've got a throat lozenge in my mouth, which I feel like a chipmunk with something stuffed in my cheek. Before I jump in, does anybody have any questions about anything before I get in? If maybe someone joined the class a little bit late, I don't know, I didn't keep super close eye on the numbers. I know we're still at 50 students, but I don't know if people left and came in or anything like that. Any questions about the course before I jump in to the content for today? You're shaking your head no, you're good. Anybody else? Everything's pretty straightforward. Okay, and of course, like when we get to next, I was gonna say Friday, but next Wednesday, we'll be having the exam the Wednesday after, so after the May long weekend, the first midterm. But I'll give you, so I'll run through some practice questions and kind of give you another explanation of what all of that looks like. Alrighty. So I guess I'll just recap a little bit where we left off before we jump into today's material. So last time we were talking about, sort of the origins of our idea here in Canada, in a Western society of youth and childhood. And we sort of traced it forward, following Neil Postman's book and some other kind of pieces of historical documentation from kind of Greco-Roman period very briefly, forward through the Middle Ages, and then into the real period that we're interested in, which is, from about the 15th century forward, and we ended up, in the at the kind of the end of the 19th century. And just kind of the thing that you should take away from that whole kind of narrative I ran through last time, is childhood, according to Postman, and I think he's right, which is why I still talk about it, and youth, right? Our concept of youth, of childhood, of adolescence, of teenagers, as these times of innocence, as these times where people are supposed to be protected from the demands of society so that they can emerge into the people that they will eventually become. The notion that they need to be shaped by society, right? The notion that they, have certain attributes that need to be built upon. All of this, has a heritage and built up really from the invention of the printing press, when society shifted because of a technology from an oral basis, so everything was spoken, to print being the dominant medium that was really important in society. And as we go forward in this, more things get discovered about children, right? As children start to be treated as a separate class, people discover more things about children, and they start to make finer and finer distinctions about what it is to be a child and what that ultimately means. So, I don't know why, that's rendering my tongue slightly numb. Okay, so that's kind of where we went from the 15th century all the way into, the 19th century, at which point, right, we get a kind of confluence of, the print revolution coming to, its fruition, and it meets up with the scientific and industrial revolutions in major ways, but especially the Industrial Revolution and the excess wealth that the Industrial Revolution creates, because it forms a whole giant middle class and upper class that's extremely wealthy, and now they can afford for their kids to be kids, right? They can afford for their kids to be delayed their entry into the economy, into adulthood, into being productive, which gives them, a chance to dote on them, to have them in this state of innocence. And then they start to look at, okay, there's all these working class kids and poor kids who are still kids, they resemble ours in important ways, but they're not being given a childhood. So they start to grant some of those rights. So you get, the emergence of social welfare systems for young people, youth criminal justice system, which overlaps with social welfare a little bit to address some of the problems that kids are facing. It comes out of this, what we call the child saving movement, which we'll revisit when we talk about crime way later on in the course, right? We get the formation of this youth criminal justice system and all these institutions that are made, to deal with young people, mostly from the state. And I didn't mention this last time, but I will mention it now because I think it's interesting and important. You also get, people just in civil society, right? Non-state actors and charity groups that start to be formed in order to kind of try to help young people with the challenges they're facing. So you can think here of things like, and these are all founded kind of at the end of the 19th and in the first couple decades of the 20th century, the Boy Scouts of America, the Girl Guides, the 4-H Club, the Boys and Girls Club of America, right? All of these, and a lot of these are still around. I think the Boy Scouts just changed their name to Scouting of America to take the boy part out. But all of these organizations in some way are still around, and they're all aimed at the same thing, which is building skills in young people, especially young people who might be deprived. Maybe they don't have especially like the Boy Scouts, it was like, oh, what happens if boys don't have a dad, right? If their dad has died or, is an alcoholic, can we put them in touch with mentors that can then sort of help guide them into adulthood as productive members of society, right? In this case, right, the Boy Scouts were about teaching survival skills and wilderness skills and kind of, manly stuff, I guess. And all of this comes out of that same child-saving movement where you get, social welfare and the youth criminal justice system popping up. Okay, so that was kind of what we covered last time, and then I just laid out the beginning parts of this argument from this book, what will occupy, I think, the bulk of today. And this is, sort of what happens through the 20th century with regards to youth, and how can we go, in two classes, I guess, from, the ancient Greeks all the way to, 2024. We'll look at these generations. Now, like I said last time, there's a couple of generations that are omitted here for just, in a sense, for clarity. I could talk about them in some detail if I wanted to, but it feels a little bit less relevant. And here we can think of specifically like two generations. One that's called the Lost Generation, and this is the generation that fought in the First World War principally, and then came back to a world and faced the Roaring 20s and then the Great Depression, and then what's called the Greatest Generation, those that fought in would have been World War II in Korea. So the Second World War and the Korean War, which went on 1950 and 1953. What was my point there? Oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Right, so these two generations. The Lost Generation, so named because they end up being very disillusioned coming out of the First World War, right? They fight in the First World War, and all of this idea of progress that had happened, that had been sort of building through the Enlightenment, the 19th century, and then into the beginning part of the 20th century, they were going to end up with these technologies that were going to make everyone's lives the greatest. Well, it ended up on the killing fields of Central and Western Europe, right, where this whole generation went to war, and things like poison gases and Gatling guns and tanks, all of this scientific prowess that the West had built was then put to use killing each other in Western Europe. And that war at the time had by far the highest casualty count of any war. And then they came back. They had a good decade in the 20s and then a bad decade in the 1930s with the Great Depression. And then the greatest generation, obviously was the generation that would have been coming of age right around the time of the Second World War. They fought, so born in the roughly in the 1920s, so that by the time they get into the 1930s and late 30s and 40s, they're of age to go fight in the war. This is a generation that overcomes a lot of the challenges of the Depression, right? And then of the Second World War and the kind of aftermath of the Second World War. And they do end up, being a quite successful generation because they come back into the United States, after the Second World War, and it's a time, and Canada and most of the West, it's a time of unequaled prosperity for about 2 decades. Okay, but we won't talk. It does that sometimes. So we won't talk too much more about them. We're going to focus on the 5 living generations, the Silents, the Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z for the rest of our time. Okay, so I guess we talked about this a little bit last time. The framework that Twenge sort of puts a lot of her approach when it comes to the different generations in is what's called life history theory, and how specifically a couple of things. The period you live in is going to really shape, like historical period is going to shape the kind of life that you have. And especially, we'll talk about this today, this transition from a world categorized by a fast life strategy where mortality was high, and so people had kids early. So they got married and had kids early. They had lots of kids, hoping that some of them would make it to adulthood or at least be self-sufficient before their parents, perished. Probably sometime in their 30s or 40s, maybe at the outside, 50s and 60s for some people. Okay, and then the slow life strategy, basically especially economies get more complex, there's more competition and you need more education, and mortality rates drop. A strategy where people have fewer children, but invest more of their time, energy, and capital into those few children so that they're more competitive, so that they're able to get increasingly scarce resources because the resources that are available require much more training. And certainly, like when we talk about work and education, we'll come back to this kind of idea in some ways because, where we are in terms of the working world today is so much different than it was, say, even for the Silents or for the baby boomers just a couple generations back, where what you're going to need and what I needed to get a good job is considerably more training, right? And this has all sorts of effects on how fast you grow up. Okay, so by nod of the head last time, we stopped at this slide without actually getting into it. Because, people were, 3-hour classes are long, and we don't want to push it too hard. Okay, so the silent generation, basically, and all of these dates, I'll say, sometimes people ask, do we need to know these dates? Well, for one, the exams are all open books, so you'll have access to them. These dates are always approximate, and when you start talking, about generations, or if you read different books on, that have generational cohorts split up in different ways, sometimes these dates are going to vary a little bit, right? So I have what I think are, and I think these are mostly Twenge's start dates. I sometimes modify them a little bit. But basically all of these are kind of approximates. And generations are a very approximate way of talking about people who shared sort of similar cultural experiences. And you get these weird phenomenons at the end of generations and the beginnings of other ones, where sometimes, say, like for me and for my sister. So my sister's born in 1980. I'm born in 1982. So we're just at the very beginning of the millennial cohort, technically. Though my sister still refuses to believe. She's like, I am not a millennial. Thank you for that. Thrilling musical cues. If I had a top hat and a cane, I would have started dancing. Can someone get me one? No? Okay. Also, I'm a terrible dancer, so no one wants to see that. Ask my wife. It's embarrassing. So, you'll get sometimes, what people are now calling micro-generations or crossover kind of years. Like I said, I'm born 1982. My sister's born 1980. In a lot of ways, being early millennials or older millennials, we have a lot more in common with kind of the tail end of Gen X. So sometimes people have come up with weird phrases like Xennial, right? So I don't know, and we'll talk about that in a sec. X millennial, instead of having an M for millennial, you put an X and an E at the beginning, so you're Gen X and millennial. I know there's some older Gen Z folks, born kind of in the kind of mid 1990s that look at younger Gen Z people born in the kind of early to mid 2000s, and don't see a lot of cultural kind of resonance with them, so they want to be Xennials too, except this time they spell it with a Z, right? So they're Gen Z millennial kind of crossover. So just to say, these are all approximate dates, right? And yeah, sometimes there's kind of crossover moments where the tail end of one generation, the beginning of another, have a lot more in common with each other. So just keep that in mind, right? They're not exact things, and it's not like, these are kind of approximate ways that social scientists use to talk about people that kind of shared rough cultural experiences. Okay, so the silent generation. Interesting. I mean, probably, if we're thinking of the silents, the most prominent silent right now is, I guess, I'm trying to think what year Donald Trump's born. I think he's a silent. No, he's not. Actually, he's just right at the beginning of the baby boomers. He's roughly the same age as my dad. But Joe Biden, President Joe Biden today is kind of on the very, very baby end, like young end of the silent generation, right? So these are folks born 1925 to 1945. So sometimes, you'll also see, depending on the person, sometimes people also call them the lucky generation. Because, basically, being born in 1925, by 1940, right, 1941, I guess, when the U.S. enters the war, they would have only been about 16 years old, so they're too young to go fight in the Second World War. For the most part, I guess the oldest of them would have been eligible at the tail end and maybe available to fight in Korea in the early 1950s. But for the most part, this is a generation that avoided really the two major conflicts of the middle part of the 20th century, but they also got all of the benefits of the kind of post-war boom, right? So they got to experience the massive economic growth that runs in the West, especially Canada and the US, from about 1945, 46 into the beginning part of the 1970s. Now, sometimes they are kind of thought to be overlooked because the two generations that kind of bookend them are generations that have received a lot more attention. And we'll talk about the baby boomers, after we talk about the silents. We talk about them a lot, A, because they won't go away, and B, because they're so kind of, because of their size. They're such a massively important generation. But the silent and the greatest generation, obviously, they're the ones that fought in the war, right? So being sandwiched between two really major generations, historically, ends up that the silents don't always get a lot of attention. But yeah, what's really interesting is we often think of the counterculture, right? The hippie movement and the kind of 1960s, 1970s counterculture as principally something that came from, say, the baby boomers, right? The generation that just follows this one. But actually, the countercultural shift, so things like the rise of feminism, right, or the women's liberation movement, the civil rights movement, all of these things were in large part actually driven by people who were part of the silent generation, right? So, yeah, so a lot of the kind of big culture, we call them the silent generation. Oh, the other word, one that sometimes used is the traditionalist generation, or the traditionalists, because social scientists can never agree on names for anything. But actually, I think this is probably the least appropriate one, because a lot of the kind of major cultural changes that happen from the middle part of the 20th century to, really into the 1980s, 1990s, is driven in lots of ways, or was started by the silence, right? They weren't so silent. They actually made huge cultural impact, but for whatever reason, all of their cultural achievements were sort of granted to the baby boomers. It's like, the boomers who did this, but actually they were too young at the time to be part of a lot of these things. And yeah, lots of the prominent media figures, even in that hippie generation, that kind of counterculture movement, right? So if we want to say, leaders of the counterculture movement, like the feminist Gloria Steinem, right, very much a silent, born in 1934. And then a lot of the entertainers, right, the people who would have been the musical icons, the cultural icons that were driving a lot of this forward. So you can think Hendrix, the Beatles, all members of the silent generation, so not actually baby boomers. And yeah, so I missed the gay rights, or the gay and lesbian rights movement out of the three movements I talked about. Because yeah, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement all, ultimately transformed the social landscape of American, Canadian, and Western societies in general. All took root in the relatively brief period, 1963 to 1970, when the silents are in their 20s and 30s, right? So they are, in our what we would call today emerging adulthood, but they're in that period where they're kind of driving the culture as young people. Okay, I know that's a lot. So, I guess, did I skip over? Oh, I feel like I skipped over a slide. I talked about Twenge too as having what's called the technology model of kind of generational cohorts, right? The generational cohorts are ultimately formed by, maybe it's on that first Twenge slide. Oh yeah, sorry. The technology model of generations, right? That's her kind of idea, that each generation is defined by the technology and technological conditions they experience in their formative years, their teens and their early 20s. Okay, so what was that technological kind of ethos, or that technological moment that the silents ultimately experienced when they were young, right? When why we're talking about them in this class. Okay, so probably the biggest technological change, right? So radio would have been pervasive through most of their lives, right? Radio comes along in the 1920s as a kind of mass culture medium, where the technology for broadcasting and receiving becomes cheap enough that most people are able to afford, a radio. And it would have been initially every family would have had one big radio in the central room in their house. And then as time went on, right, they miniaturized and people got smaller and smaller radios. So radio would have been really well established for the silent generation from kind of, earliest life. So they would have been very familiar with the radio being kind of omnipresent. And growing up, they would have been, a generation that experienced things like, oops, I dropped my little plastic cover for my pen. Radio dramas, right? So radio dramas, stories, like you would think of what television shows today, were being broadcast on the radio through the 20s, the 30s, and into the 1940s. I don't know if they still do. For a long time, I think it's the 6:30 CHED still broadcast some of these old radio shows, I think between 11 and 2 in the morning or something. And they're kind of a weird, you can find them as podcasts still. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. They're kind of interesting to listen to. They're these sort of things out of time. Okay, technological transformation that comes for them. And again, they would have been very young for the most part when this happens. Television comes on the scene. So television had been around since the 30s as a technology, but it only becomes really technologically viable and commercially viable in the 1950s, right? So by 1952, most of the big broadcasting companies in the US, so it will be ABC, NBC, and CBS, though CBS had a different name, the Dumont Television and Radio Network in the early days, kind of come on the scene and start broadcasting television shows. And again, mostly the technology starts very expensive amongst the kind of middle and upper classes. Everybody scrambles to get a television. And as we move forward into the 60s and 70s, it becomes more and more available. So what does Twenge talk about? Why was television such a major and important technology for, you know, people in the United States in particular, but for this generation in general? Okay, so I should say bless you, but I said that once in class, and someone was watching on live stream, and they were like, "How did you know?" And so now I'm like, should I say it, or am I going to freak someone out who's watching at home? It's because I see all and I know all. Hopefully not. That'd be horrifying. So, I mean, what Twenge suggests is that television in particular, and this has been talked about in media studies, it very closely mirrors how you see, right? When you look at a TV screen, it very closely mirrors the eye. And so what it allowed for her is people to see others' perspectives and experiences, right? And especially, this will become really important when we get to, say, the period of the Vietnam War, because it brings that, you know, the Second World War, for all of its horrors, was fairly uncontroversial, as was the war in Korea, right? So the Korean War, fought between 50 and 53, was relatively uncontroversial at the time. It's Vietnam, right, which is fought, you know, starts as a French conflict in Asia, and then the Americans jump in the 1960s, becomes a really, really major conflict and a major inflection point for American society, in large part because of television, right? Because television brings the visuals of the Vietnam War into people's homes, and they see, you know, what it looks like in Vietnam. They see Vietnamese people suffering, and they, you know, you get things like photos and video taken of things like the My Lai massacre, brought into people's home. And they see this and experience it in a very different way than past generations had, right? So it's no longer possible to kind of hide the horrors of war. So it allows you to see things through other people's perspectives. Eventually, right, this will happen too with, say, LGBT people, where television gives you a way of experiencing and seeing what they're experiencing too. So it brings along a lot of kind of changes in perspective, or Black people, right? It brings a lot of, you know, you're sitting in your house, but images of the world are being brought into your house, and you can see what other people's lives are like in ways that weren't really possible before, right? You could go to the theater, but it was less pervasive. Okay, especially jet or air travel and space travel, right, are important because they start to make the world smaller, right? As air travel gets a lot better and faster, people start to travel more. They travel to first different parts of their own countries in the US, and then to Europe and other parts of the world more. So you get more interaction between cultures, more migration, and all of these sorts of things, right? So really important that it kind of shrinks down the world. And you think of, you know, the difference between a period when before you had jet travel and after you have jet travel, and what that kind of makes possible. You know, if you wanted to go prior to air travel being really easily commercially available, you wanted to go to Europe, right? You wanted to go to Latin or South America. You were doing that on a boat, right? So you were taking a train to a boat, the boat across the sea to a place. It took forever, right? And the shrinking of the world through jet travel especially is really important. Space travel eventually will do this as well. Now, space travel comes a little bit later, right? We get the first man-made satellite in 1957, which is the Soviet satellite Sputnik, and then Yuri Gagarin, the Russian cosmonaut, goes into space in 1962, April of 1962. So, you know, that's a little bit lagging here, but eventually, right, it opens up things like satellite communication, and all of these sorts of, really fast ways of transmitting information. Okay, that's important. This one's really important. So, you start to get a shift away from, or a growth of a part of the economy that's specifically focused on service, right? The service part of the economy grows exponentially. And in some ways, right, certain things differentiate away from institutions that had long run them. So for example, hospitals and the kind of whole healthcare industry had long been very closely associated with religious groups, right? Especially the Roman Catholic Church in Canada and the US. The church ran hospitals. And who staffed those hospitals? Well, it was priests and nuns, principally, right? You had doctors, but a lot of the nurses were also nuns. As, a bunch of other kind of cultural changes happen, there are fewer nuns and fewer priests, and these institutions are differentiated, right? They split off from the church and they come to be run by the state or quasi-state actors. And this opens up a lot of space for people to work in kind of service industries, but especially industries outside of manufacturing, construction, farming, and kind of mineral extraction. As these things grow, like secretarial work, banking work, finance, teaching, nursing, social work, as these parts of the economy sort of expand, it actually creates a huge opportunity for women to enter into the workforce in ways that that work a little bit better for them, right? A lot of these kind of physical labor jobs, are things that men are really good at in the sense that they take a lot of physical strength. Not that women can't do them, they just more fall in the affinities for men. When the service industries start to grow and open up, women have a lot more opportunity in the economy as well. And again, this is driven in some, to some extent by technological changes as well, right? As the economy develops, as manufacturing, a lot of people come back and manufacture things. As the economy really grows, you need more people doing, say, I guess in the early days, it's secretarial work, right? As the population grows in the post-war boom, you need a lot more teachers, a lot more nurses, and all of these sorts of things. And this gives women opportunities to work in traditionally female kind of fields that are expanding, so a lot more of them can get out of the home. And what we sometimes think of is like the baby boomers who are the first ones to, go to work after their kids, were in school. It's actually the silence that did it first in a lot of ways. Okay, this one's also really important. They're all really important. Otherwise I wouldn't have them on the slides, right? You have the beginning here of a sort of shift in ideologies. And we're going to see this progress generation by generation, right? And you can think of this on, I don't want to say a spectrum, let's say a timeline, right? Where we're starting with the silence here. And I mean, theoretically, some of these ideas have been percolating for a long time, and they're going to find their apogee or highest point. So I'll put an S here, with the silence. And as we move along this timeline, the boomers, the Gen X and the millennials are all more and more kind of moving in this direction. And that's specifically moving away from kind of ideas grounded in community, I would say, and especially that there are social rules and duties that people have to their society, to their communities, to their families, more towards a kind of notion of individual rights as being the highest kind of measure of morality or what's right and wrong. And again, this is, I say, the silent, it starts with the silence. It really goes back much further than that, right, into the 19th or 18th century with the Enlightenment, right, with people like Voltaire and Jefferson and Adam Smith, all of these kind of folks, right, Rousseau, all of them, it's kind of a building thing, but it really picks up pace and fundamentally changes society the most in this period from, say, the silence to Gen Z. Okay. Yeah, so how much does this change and how quickly does it change? In the 60s, black and white people in the south of the US were segregated so that basically this was under a principle that had been proffered in the South under Jim Crow laws that said that, black people and white people should be separate but equal. So they should have separate institutions for whites, institutions for black people, and that they should mix as little as possible. Now, of course, how this actually played out was tremendous inequality. African Americans, black people got a lot less than white people did and were mistreated in lots of ways. Though in this period, African American wealth, education, and all kind of markers of social well-being actually grew tremendously as well. In the 60s, women were basically limited to a few positions, and there were still sort of like professionally, and there were still vestiges of kind of social rules around, once a woman got married, or certainly once she had children, that her working life should be over, right? That she should, then exit the formal workforce, and she could work informally out of the home, but not as a formal part of the economy. So all that is still kind of there. And by the 1970s, all of that has begun to change in major ways, right? And people, the later born silents, were the first to experience a third of their mothers working. So even, older silents and even some of the greatest generation women were working when they were school age, about a third. So huge kind of change away from this idea of, the woman's place is in the home, right? Although that's still kind of a social ideology. Okay. This stuff is wild. Because the numbers are so unbelievable when you actually kind of think about it. I don't know. I got to tell you this story. Okay, so what you'd had kind of through the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century was a kind of weird pattern. So this is age at first marriage, where you'd had a couple of things happening. And this is prior to contraception being available. So keep that in mind. Is you had a sort of slow but steady decline in a decline in fertility and an increase in the age at which women first got married, right? So through the 19th century, women started to get married later and later. By the beginning part of the 20th century, right, it was about 22 years old when they got married. And, the number of children that women had was declining pretty steadily through the 19th and into the beginning part of the 20th century, right? People, despite not having artificial contraception, people understood how you get pregnant well enough that they were able to kind of work their ways around this in some ways. All of this changes with the silence, right? The silence is a sort of reversal of a whole bunch of historical patterns, and this one is a kind of interesting one, right? So you had, at the beginning of the 20th century, men were getting married for the first time on average at about 26, women at about 22, right? So considerably later than what would have been historically the norm for human societies. What you get with the silence, so this gray area is where, we're kind of talking about the silence. The age at which people got married drops considerably, right around the end of the Second World War. Sometimes we think like this decrease, particularly sort of, here is a little bit weird, but it's within the historical range. But this big drop, down towards, 20 being kind of more the norm, is a really weird kind of historical inversion. So the silents got married really, really young. And I think, this stat is wild, right? So in the 1950s, nearly half of new brides, right? So half of the women getting married were teenagers. Now, the bulk of these are 18 and 19. There are some, what we would call shotgun weddings, a little bit younger than that. But the bulk of these are people who are entering adulthood, right? So they are adults. But they're getting married very, very young. And you see, like, this doesn't fully kind of reverse until kind of almost the end of the 1960s, where it kind of returns to its sort of normal historical pattern of a slow kind of increase in the age of first marriage, right? So, yeah, it reaches its kind of lowest point at about 20, Is that for women? Yeah, for women in 1956, right? So the average age at which you would have gotten married in 1956, if you were a woman, was just over your 20th birthday, which means that probably not an unconsiderable number of the young women in this room would have already been married, right? And probably on to your first child. And a good note, half of the women getting married would have been just out of high school, teenagers. And again, some of this was what you would call shotgun marriages, right? Someone gets pregnant, well, not someone, a woman gets pregnant, and then, you get married because of kind of social duty. But some of this is just kind of the normal social progression. Okay, so what's happening? A lot of this is economic, right? Along with this kind of drop in the age of marriage, right, which starts right around the end of the Second World War, you have some of it that's people trying to get married to their high school sweetheart, before they ship off for Europe or the Pacific, but most of it is actually driven by post-war prosperity. So what happens, right? The economy after the end of the Second World War in the US and in Canada explodes, right? In a good way. Prosperity rises, there are great jobs available, wages are rising at the fastest rate in history for the working class. Inequality is at its historic low, right? So basically, this is the period at which, the disparity between business owners, right, or in Marx's terms, the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat is at its slimmest, right? So the difference between the owner of a company and his average wage, or the kind of managerial class and their wage, and the working class is at its lowest, through this period of about 1945 to about 1970. So you can do things in this period, like if you graduate from high school, right? You're a young person, a man, and you graduate from high school, and let's say you're living in Windsor, Ontario, because why not? You can go down to the Ford factory down the street and talk to the foreman and say, hey, I would really like a job at the Ford factory. I'd like you to take me on and teach me how to be an auto worker. And he looks around, he needs workers because he's producing more cars than he knows what to do with. Demand is at an all-time high. And so he hires you and you step into a job that's going to pay you, decent wages, enough to buy a house, to marry your high school sweetheart, and to start having children, basically almost from your 18th or 19th birthday. So that prosperity means the ability to move into adulthood, right, happens really, really early for the silents, because the barriers to entry into the economy are very low. The amount of skill you need to enter the economy is relatively low, and you've been given a lot of those skills in public education. So you can jump into the workforce, right? You can go to the factory, you can become a mechanic, you can become a plumber, you can do any number of things that are going to get you a nice middle-class wage, which will allow you to buy one of the houses that are being built in the suburbs, with a white picket fence and a couple of rooms, and you can marry Betty, your high school sweetheart, and off you go to the races. She's maybe a couple years younger than you, so you wait till she graduates from high school, or you knock her up and marry her before she graduates from high school, and off you go to the races. You are an adult, and you're doing adult things like mortgages, jobs, and the like. Okay, so most of them, meet their spouses in college or high school and get married really close after graduation. One of the things that's still true, and I guess why they're called the traditionalists sometimes, is that social conformity is really important. And this is actually, generally kind of true of younger human beings. Conformity tends to be really important, and so you tend to do what other people are doing. So they got married because everyone else was doing it, right? It was just the thing you did, and there were these very developed social scripts as to how you went through life, right? So if you met someone, you went to college or university, you joined a fraternity, you joined a fraternity, you get your fraternity pin, you find yourself a girl you like, you give her your fraternity pin to show that you're going steady, and then once in your senior year, you propose to her, probably she accepts, and then, when you both graduate, you get married. And that's sort of the script that happens, right? Very established social script, and almost everybody would have been doing the same things. So you just follow the crowd. You kind of do what everybody else is doing. And this is kind of true of all generations, right? You follow the trends, right? So if everybody is waiting later to get married, you wait later to get married. Even in kind of silly things, right? The people around you will affect your behavior in major ways. Say if you are, you have a sister, you're a woman, you have a sister, your sister gets pregnant, your odds of getting pregnant in the next 2 years go up about 60%. So weird stuff, we tend to copy people around us, and this is what's happening with the silence. Okay, how are we doing? I know it's a lot of history. Was that a thumbs up or a die, like the old gladiator, like kill him, kill him? All right. So the silence had almost said a bad word. The silence had a lot of babies, like a lot of babies. It's actually sort of impressive if you think about it. And I don't mean that from like a physical standpoint, though certainly that's true as well. Yeah, okay. Just the sheer scale of the number of children that were born to the silence is a sort of thing of wonders. I don't say that to be facetious or anything. It's just really, really, it's a historical oddity. Like, it's just one that sort of still defies explanation in some ways. Okay, so why? Well, one of the most common family forms for the silence would have been something that probably seems really familiar to us, right? Which would have been 2-children families, right? So even prior to, so contraception, for I guess the curious, I know I have it somewhere else in these slides. Basically, the contraceptive pill, right, the birth control pill, is approved by the FDA in 1957 for certain female bleeding disorders, and gets approved as a contraceptive in 1961, right? A little bit later in Canada. In Canada, it's not till 1968, because Canada at the time was a little bit more conservative than the United States. Okay, but even prior to this, right, fertility had been kind of dropping, right? So you see, 1900, the average number of children per woman, so the average number of children a woman will have in her life, what's called the total fertility rate. I guess it's women in the fertile range. The fertile range is 15 years old to about 44. So women 15 to 44 in 1900 would have been expected to have on average 2.5 kids. On average, right? There's not having a half child, but on average. So, and you see it kind of drops, at the beginning of the 20th century, a tiny bit. It goes up and down kind of here. But this was kind of much lower than the historical average, right? So this has been dropping through the 19th century, from 3-4 being the norm prior to that. And then you hit the silence, right? So yeah, during the Great Depression, maybe not surprisingly, total fertility was 2.5 children per woman. And again, no contraception. At its peak, you should take away is, while they didn't have contraception, there are sort of certain natural ways that people can use to not have children if they don't want to. But for the silence, right, it peaks at about 3.8 children per woman. And that would be kind of on the high side of even, fertility in the world today, right? If you look at countries with really, really high fertility, they tend to be fairly poor countries without good access to medical services and not a lot of female empowerment. 3.8 through 4.5 is probably where things kind of peak out, unless you're Afghanistan. I can't remember what Afghanistan is, but it's really, really high. It doesn't return to 2.5 children per woman until 1968, at which point it then continues to drop. And by 1973, it drops below what's called replacement, which is 2.1 children per woman. Okay, so do I have this on I can't remember if I have this on the next slide. No. All right, I'm gonna throw down some numbers here, because it's actually rather remarkable. So in this period, right, in between these two gray marks, in the US, oh, sorry, that's a terrible 7. I'm going to redo that. Eraser. How many babies do you think were born? Any guesses? I'll tell you. All right. Oh, that's a highlighter. What are you even doing, Broussard? Got fat fingers. So in this period, you have 76 million babies born. So basically between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the 1970s, right, or 1968. 76 million babies born. To put that in some sort of historical context, that is more people than currently live in France. So basically, in a decade and a half, American women birthed France, or roughly half the population of the Russian Federation, right? So, and Russia's a big country with a big population. There's a huge population increase. Canada, by the way, so this is on a population for the US of somewhere in the range of about 100 million. Canada's population, which would have been about about 11 million at the time, birthed 8.6 million babies, which is also a fairly incredible number for a relatively small country, right? Not quite doubling the size of the population, but pretty damn close. And of course, some people die. So this is a historic fertility boom, right? We've seen nothing like it since, right? Like I said, 1972, Canada and the US both fall below 2.1 children per woman, which is below what's called the replacement rate. So if you just want to keep your population steady, 2.1 children per woman is the number. If you want it to grow, it's about 2.3, 2.2, 2.3. That's very slow growth. 3.8 is crazy. It's unreal in terms of, especially in industrialized societies. Industrialized societies tend to have really low fertility. Now, not all is hunky-dory for women in this period. They're both having a lot of babies. Some of them are working, and they're also living in a culture that I think fairly would be called somewhat patriarchal. And so you have them also, doing the bulk of domestic tasks, caring for children, doing like domestic, compassionate work, caring for children and older parents, and carrying the kind of load there on the whole, right? So this births, sometimes women in the period, and especially the kind of early women's rights campaigners talked about, domestic work for women who were working being a second shift, right? Or sometimes referred to it as the double day. I don't know if I can write on the bottom of my screen. So a lot of the complaints of the feminist movement coming into the period of, that's double day, not double dax. It's just hard to write with the stylus on the screen as it shifts. So a lot of the kind of early complaints of the feminist movement, oh my God, I've been talking an hour and I'm not through the silence. Oh God. I find this stuff unbelievably fascinating, as you can tell. Right, the silents are kind of the first generation that experiences this tension between a lot of women are working full-time and wanting to work full-time, but also in charge of the responsibilities. What the feminist movement will start to say is an unfair allocation of domestic work. That they work their shift at work, right, and then they work their shift at home, right? So you get this kind of conflict theory thinking of kind of labor and domestic labor as a form of unpaid labor. Okay, so some stuff a little bit out. So that's when they're young. Some things that kind of, will carry forward with them, and some stuff I want to tell you as they get older. The silents have been remarkably resilient in lots of ways, right? Especially in terms of mental health. They've been far less prone to isolation, depression, and self-harm, including things like suicide, deaths of despair, right? So we tend to think of deaths of despair as, suicide, cirrhosis of the liver, or deaths caused by alcohol or drug overdoses. Far less susceptible to any of these things, which Twenge in her account puts down to how well socially connected they were, right? They came from big families. They were still born in an era where, communities were fairly cohesive. The kind of breakdown, bless you, sorry, I'm trying to scare someone at home. The breakdown of things like traditional religious communities hadn't really happened yet. And so they're really well anchored in a whole bunch of community forms, right? And through their lives, this is one of the, along with the boomers, this is the generation that's going to be most involved in things like civil society, right? They found clubs and civil service organizations, NGOs. They're involved in religious groups through their whole lives, right? Like my grandma was just on the early end of the silent generation. She's passed now. But through her entire life, right, up until she was 90, she would go with the ladies at church once a year, and they made meat pies to sell as the fundraiser for the church, right? And I don't know how she did it at 90, but she was still rolling out pie dough like a pro. So, they were involved in these things very deeply. And so they were very integrated into communities. They had a lot of friends, and they had really tight social networks that were very, very active and would be through their whole lives. I touched the laptop and I killed the screen. There it is. I don't know why it does that. Oh, here it is. Sorry. I had my thing about France here. Right, 76 million babies born in this period. A reversal of 200 years of declining birth rates. So what happens, right? Okay, so we're done with the silence. That's the end of the silence. We're going to talk about the baby boomers, right? So the boomers, again, this range sometimes gets disputed. 46 is usually the year that people start it. Sometimes I've seen people put it as early as the end of 1945, but I think for safety, let's put it at 1946, and ends roughly in 1963. I've tended to put it about 62, but some people will put it at 1964 in terms of the birth years for this demographic, right? So, this is mostly the children born out of that post-war baby boom, right? The greatest generation and the silents are popping out babies like they're going out of style. And the result is this demographic of the baby boomers. And yeah, it is what we call a very large and sustained demographic bulge. So, demographics, right? Have any of you taken demography? Did any of you take Frank's class? You're like, no, you did? Oh, I remember, right, because you got sick in the middle and you were worried you weren't going to finish. Yes, I remember. Okay, normal demographic distribution for populations typically looks kind of like this top graph, right? Where you have a lot of young people at the bottom and not that many old people at the top, right? In this kind of slice, it will tend to get thinner because people die off, right? That's a very normal historical kind of demographic pyramid. And anything else looks weird. The boomers, right, are this massive demographic, what we call a bulge or a bubble, right? So we see them here, right, in this chart, kind of at the bottom, right? Young people kind of sticking out, and that's pretty normal. What happens with the boomers is they move through and they dominate the landscape of kind of American and Canadian life, basically until the last of them are dead, right? And that's going to be a while. Like the oldest of them now are in their 70s, right? Kind of in their late 70s, should be moving into their 80s in the next few years. But we've had with the boomers, it's a very weird generation, and they were super influential, not just because of the values they brought. We'll talk about that in a second, but because of the size of the demographic kind of bubble that was created. So as they've moved through life, right, they've gone and they've always been this big kind of bulge, right? And where a normal demographic pyramid should look like the one at the top, the current demographic pyramid, I guess this is 2020, so it will have changed a little bit, but in the United States, is really, really fat at the top, right? Where there's basically as many old people as there are young people. And this comes with a whole raft of social problems in that, when you have, less of these people right here than these people, the number of workers supporting retirees gets to be a little bit of a problem. But that's, a problem for Gen Z and millennials as young people, not for the boomers. Okay, because they're so big, right, the boomers dominate the landscape at every stage that they move through life, right? So when they're in their teens, because they're so big, they're consuming a lot, they're a huge market, and their cultural values come to sort of predominate in major ways. Aha. Okay, so what is it that the boomers sort of bring into the world? Okay, amongst other things, right? A lot of the changes that the silence started are well underway by the time the boomers get into their late teens and early 20s, right? Or their teens and early 20s, right? So if you're born in 1945, right, by 1960, you're 15, and you're on the sort of, I guess the starting edge of that big social transformation being pushed by the silent generation, right? Around women's rights, gay rights, and in the U.S., the civil rights movement and the rights of African Americans, the growth of kind of minority rights as something that people are really thinking about, right? So, and then by the time you get into the middle part of the 1960s, you're, kind of in your 20s. The baby boomers are coming into their late teens and 20s, and they are taking all of these things that were started by the silent generation and really running with them. And they bring that huge demographic kind of power that they have, to bear on the culture. And the culture really, really transforms, right? So the boomers, even more individualistic than the silents were, right? And they move more away on that kind of trajectory that I was talking about, away from kind of duties, kind of responsibilities to communities, away from that into more individualism and individual rights as the focus. So they reject, what they see as outdated prejudices and centered on individual choices as their core value. Now, they also, right, so are coming into adulthood, after the birth control pill, right? So again, 1957 and 1961 in the US, 1968 in Canada. There were ways to get it prior to that. So they are, they have access to things like birth control. And they start to break a lot of traditional and then break a lot of kind of traditional assumptions about what people's roles are, how you move through life, what the order of things is. Basically kind of transform the culture. So we know, right, that the hippie generation, right, that the kind of counterculture generation of the 60s and 70s, had this emphasis on kind of drugs and free love. These are all, or sex outside of marriage as kind of normalized. And these are all things that the baby boomers embrace in big numbers, right? So I know now it's like fun and trendy to say, okay, boomer, to like outdated old people. But in their time, they were a revolutionary age cohort. And if you like the way the world is today, you owe a great deal to the baby boomers and their willingness to transgress social norms and social rules. Okay, so most boomers, in 1970 said it was okay to have sex before marriage, while most silents and the greatest said no. By 85% of adults said sex before marriage was wrong in 1967. So when, the greatest, before a lot of the baby boomers come into that kind of demographic window, but by the time the boomers are well ensconced and have sort of transformed the culture, right? So it dropped from 85% to 37%, right? So amongst other things, they also, start to move away from traditional religion. You have the breakdown, this kind of beginning of the defection away from, all sorts of Christian faiths by this generation. More tolerant of LGBT people, principally, I guess, gay and lesbian to start with. Transgender people will come along a little bit later, more in the millennial and Gen Z kind of generational cohorts as being accepted. But certainly gay and lesbian people, much more accepted by the boomers. Okay, so I spoiled everything, by the way. I already told you about the birth control pill. Okay, so TV. TV is really important for them too. Why? A little bit different, because the silents were the last generation born prior to television's introduction. For the boomers, TV is there their entire lives, right? From the time that they're young, the boomers are ultimately watching television. And again, it does a lot of things for them, right? It expands their horizons. shows them all sorts of things. You get a fairly liberal Hollywood, constantly pushing kind of against social norms on television in lots of ways. So television is important for them. The pill, also really important and can't be under kind of stated. It made kind of widely available in 1960, 1961, was available prior to that, in the late 1950s. But for the first time, and again, I don't want to understress the importance of the birth control pill, because for the first time it allows women to control their fertility and separates sex from contraception to a degree. And why I say to a degree, because contraception does have this, the birth control pill's gotten better and contraceptives have gotten better over time, but they still have this nasty habit of failing, and people still get pregnant while taking contraceptives. So to a degree, it separates sex from conception, and eventually, right, the desire to really separate sex from conception fully will ultimately lead to like the abortions rights movement, which in the U.S. finds its apogee in 1973 with the decision of Roe v. Wade, which until recently basically enshrined abortion as a constitutional right that women had access to, which couldn't be fundamentally blocked by the state to too great a degree. In Canada, I want to say it's 1986, but I actually can't remember the exact year. It's Morgentaler v. Crown, which basically the Supreme Court rules that the existing laws in Canada that stop abortion and make abortion illegal were unconstitutional and had to be reworked, and basically it led to the scrapping of all abortion laws. And I think Brian Mulroney in the late 1980s was the last one who tried to put limits on abortion in a legal way. I think he wanted to go to 20 week. You could have an abortion until your 20th week, and then not after that. It fails, and nobody's ever tried again because it's not a political winner, shall we say. I'm pretty sure it's 86 Morgentaler in Canada, but I could have the year wrong. I know the case is right. Okay, so this obviously allows, in those cases where contraception fails, you still have a sort of medical recourse for, not having a baby. Okay, the pill obviously allows for much greater sexual experimentation, particularly for women, right? Because you suddenly aren't risking getting pregnant, and is slowly going to chip away at the sort of traditional family structure and that traditional sort of way of going, I guess, how to put this? Wanting to have sex and the fact that you couldn't have sex without at least the risk of someone being pregnant, so it made it really risky for women, was a big incentive for people to get married relatively young, right? Why? Because basically, young people want to have sex, and the only way to have sex was to basically commit to someone because the risk for women was too great. The birth control pill absolutely flips that on its head, right? And kind of does away with that. So suddenly the risk is lessened. And so, people don't need to get married to have sex, and it will chip away at the age of first marriage. Okay, but the last one I want to talk about, because this is, I think, I don't know, see, I get excited about stupid things like washing machines because I'm a sociology nerd at the end of the day, and I think it's really important. So there is an argument to be made, and I actually think it's a pretty good one, that the most revolutionary invention for the baby boomers and the ones that probably transformed social life the most is not the birth control pill, though it definitely was revolutionary. It's not television, but it's actually the washing machine and the dishwasher. Okay, so why do I say that? And you've probably been reading my slides, so maybe you know. A large part of women's time, especially, prior to the invention of these things, would have been spent doing the work of what Marxists will call social reproduction, right? Which is just, I won't underline it, but it's really, really important. I'll highlight it. That's what I'll do. If you can't tell, I'm a bit of a random person. Social reproduction, super important, fun Marxist term. If you come take sociology of work and industry with me, I think in the fall, talk about social reproduction until the cows come home. A lot of women's work prior to the invention of these things was just keeping the family going, which is cooking food, cleaning clothes, and so cooking food and then cleaning up after the cooking of food, right? And cleaning the house, right? Keeping things hygienic, tidy, and orderly. These machines take a lot. I don't even know. Should I tell you this? I'll tell you this. When I was growing up, my mom, who grew up on the farm and still had some farm type ideas, was convinced that the way to get really dirty clothes clean was with an old style washing board, right? Which she had learned on the farm, in northern Alberta prior to her mom having a washing machine. And described, I've talked to her about this because it's kind of, to me, it's wild, right? She grew up without running water, which is, anyway, a wild thing. They had to go to the outhouse in the middle of winter, which I assume was a lot of fun in northern Alberta. Anyway, so she was convinced that this was the best way to get like grass stains out of clothes. And basically it involved, this board with kind of a ridged glass. You would physically kind of, put soap on and scrub things against. And prior to the invention of the washing machine, this is pretty much how people washed clothes, right? If you were going to wash your clothes, probably your mom was going to be scrubbing the shit out of that thing on a glass washboard. And you can imagine how much work that took, right? And then you would hang it up on a clothesline. So it was just cleaning your clothes was hours of work, which probably explained why people had a lot less clothes. And why kids had play clothes that was specifically meant to be dirtied, and then you changed into your, clean clothes for later. So the dishwasher. Obviously, if you've ever had your dishwasher break, have you ever had your dishwasher break? You know how much of a pain in the butt it is to wash every fork and plate. Imagine doing that every day. Now, if you're my mom's family, it was a French-Canadian family with 14 kids. Imagine washing the cutlery and plates for 14 children. Whoever happened to be the village priest came over, so that's an extra plate, fork, and knife, and all that stuff. And farm workers, right, you're washing. Just imagine that every single day, 3 meals a day. Dishwasher saves a lot of that. The microwave, to some extent, right, speeds up cooking and allows things like pre-prepared meals or leftovers to be served much more easily. Refrigeration as a mass thing, also a big deal. I don't have it on the list. But all of these labor-saving devices, right, things that allow you to keep food fresh, to wash clothes, dishes, the vacuum cleaner, right, which allows you to clean the house a whole hell of a lot faster than sweeping everything or taking that carpet outside and beating the heck out of it with a stick to get the dust out. That's honestly what people used to do. All of this removes a lot of the labor that women had to do just to keep families going, right? To keep human beings alive, women did a lot of this domestic labor. Once you create all of these things, oops, where's my pen? I destroyed everything. Once you invent these things, and once you get them mass distributed, a lot of that time, right? A lot of the time that goes to social reproduction is now automated, more or less. At some point, my children will learn that the clothes doesn't magically jump from the washer to the dryer, but that's a different story. It's somewhat automated, right? You don't have to sit there and scrub the clothes. You just throw it in with a little bit of Tide, and there you go. Your clothes comes out clean. You put it in the dryer, you hang it, right? So this means that, women spend way less time on domestic tasks, which gives them a lot more time to then go work, right? So their entry into the workforce in huge numbers is at least somewhat predicated on the ability to automate domestic labor, right? Which women still do a lot of. Not my wife. She's a lousy cook, so I don't let her cook anymore. I swear, her idea of cooking is pasta noodles and just pasta sauce straight out of the jar. It's a horror beyond words. I had a flashback to last night. I'm mean to my wife sometimes. She is really a bad cook. And she would admit this, and also that she does not care. Terrible choices were made at some point in my life. Kidding. But yeah, like the ability to kind of free up this time allows women to go into the workforce, to work, and not, and the family doesn't fall apart, right? That task of social reproduction, of keeping everything going, doesn't fall apart. So the social pressure to keep women in the home and doing these domestic tasks really lessens. Now, I keep meaning to look this up. There's this great scene in The Simpsons. It's an early season of The Simpsons, and maybe during the break, I'll see if I can find it, where Marge and Homer, they move off to some other city, and Homer works for Scorpio, this guy who runs a nuclear plant, and the house that's given by the company is all automated. So Marge has nothing to do during the day, so she starts to drink wine. This is kind of what happens to women, right? Women have so much free time because all of these tasks are automated. They then want to go out and do other things and be productive in the economy in other ways, right? So, it also gives them a ton of freedom, not to be dependent financially on their husbands, so they can divorce the husbands they don't like, but that'll come a little bit later. Okay, anyway, I will say, I think this is probably the most important. These labor-saving devices probably transform the world at least as much as birth control does, because of how much it upends the social order and the sort of way society was structured before, where men did work outside the home, women did domestic work. Okay. You want to talk weird measures of growing individualism? So individualism, right? The boomers are much more individualistic, and this will show up, at least in part, in how they name their children. So they start rejecting the rules set out by society. Tradition goes out the window in lots of ways. Really replace the kind of fitting into society with a kind of quest for self-discovery. And it kind of shifts. So what I'll say is, in their teen years, right? When the teen and kind of early adult years, right, what we would call the emerging adult years in the 20s, they're very counterculture. A weird thing happens, when they kind of get into their 30s. This is often put by people who lived through the period as the boomers sold out, right? They traded in the long hair and tie-dye for white shirts and ties, and they went corporate, if you will. So yeah, they kind of, they're very revolutionary in their early years. By the time they reach kind of the end of their emerging adult years, they start to settle down a bit, but they don't go back to that kind of I need to do what's good for society, and I need to do my duty. I probably should rejoin the religion that I left when I was in my wild years. What they actually sort of go on is a quest for self-discovery. And so what you get out of kind of the 1980s and forward, driven in lots of ways by the baby boomers, is what you probably today call, self-help, the self-help movement, or a movement of kind of, limitless self-discovery. So the baby boomers very much, trade in the tie-dye for questions about what their purpose in life is, but always in a very individualistic way, right? Okay, so it's not like, they go back to asking, what does God wish of me in the sort of medieval way? Or what is the good life in say, the Aristotelian way? No, it's very much like, I really like sports cars. How do I build that into my identity, or something like that, right? You start doing yoga and all these fun things. Okay, funny things to point out, and you see the growing individuality in Western society. And this is hilarious. In 1880, nearly half of boys were given 10 names, and you could probably count it. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John would have been, 4 of them, so gospel names. Adam would have been in there as well. I'm trying to think if I can remember some of the other ones, but Charles would have been a big one. Some of the king names, but there's 10 really straight up names. One in 4 girls. So if you're a boy, almost everyone in your class is named Matthew. That's just how it goes. If you're a girl, it's even worse, right? Because you've got Annes, you've got Marys. I'm trying to think of what other really common. Anne, and Mary are really, really common ones, obviously because they're biblical. But yeah, 1 in 4 girls received one of the 10 most popular names, all right? A quarter of girls all essentially had the same names. So yeah, if you were sick, you thought having 2 Jennifers in the same class was annoying, or 2 Sarahs. Sarah's would have been one of them, actually, because that's another good biblical name. If you would have had 15 Sarahs in your class. But 100 years later, when the baby boomers, start naming their own kids, only 1 in 5 receives the most popular name, so the name's on the top 10 list. And since 2010, it's only 1 out of 14. And increasingly, right, it's hard to even measure because, is this the same name as this? So that's an N. It's pronounced the same, but technically, if we're counting, they're different names. So I have it here. Aiden was one that was really popular for a while, and I remember my wife and I had 3 different couple friends, none of whom knew each other, that all named their first boys Aiden, but they all spelled it completely differently. And so for years, like it was Aiden, A-I-D-E-N, Aiden, A-E-D-E-N. I'm like, oh guys. And I can't remember the third one. It was some weird spelling. And so inevitably, every time we wrote like birthday cards or were invited to their birthday parties, it was just like, which Aiden is this? Is this A-I or this A-E? And it's just absolute mess, right? So, even here, putting Jackson and Jackson together as one name is technically not right. And this happens, especially with the millennials. Millennials shift to not only naming their kids uniquely, but spelling them uniquely so that they stick out. Okay. Got one. Okay. Why don't we do this one last slide, and then for the boomers, and we'll take like a 20-ish minute break. Okay, so the boomers. The boomers, through their whole lives, right, it starts pretty early, but they struggle with mental health 2 or 3 more times more than silence did at the same age. And this is pretty consistent, right? It starts in the college years, right? So they're okay through adolescence, but the second they go off to kind of work or college, it gets worse and persisted into their 70s, right? So the oldest of the silents now, are 79? 79. And still, reporting worse mental health rates than the silents at the same age. The suicide rate for boomers were consistently higher than they were for the silents. And even, right, historically kind of weirdly high when you compare them to the generation that follows, Generation X. Weird things. Born in 1964, right, the last boomer year, you're 35% more likely to take your own life than someone born in 1935, right, towards the beginning of that silent generation era. This is the generation probably most marked by deaths of despair. Right, so when we started talking about the opioid epidemic a few years ago, I don't know if you were kind of paying attention. I mean, some of you were in high school and junior high when this started to happen. The deaths of despair, especially people were talking about white people, especially white men in the Midwest, really were suffering deaths of despair. And this is suicide, overdose, and liver failure, usually caused by alcoholism. Really started in the white working class when they were kind of 45 to 54. And once they hit 55, black people were more or less immune in the US, as were Latinos, right? They had other problems, but deaths of despair were not among them. But once they hit kind of 55, 64, all boomers kind of rose in terms of their deaths of despair. Rates of cancer, heart disease declined, but their deaths of despair actually increased significantly, right? So more alcoholism, more drug overdoses, and such. Now, Twenge will suggest that she thinks this is possibly due to the less stable relationships that they built, right? Compared to the silent generation, which built these really strong and durable social networks, had big families, the boomers had relatively small families that would have had fewer children, less connected to religion, to community organizations. And so potentially, as they get older and face more challenges, more susceptible to things like deaths of despair. Okay, let's take 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Is that too long? No, 20 minutes. So I don't want you to feel like you're not getting your money's worth out of the class. I could talk more, I promise, endlessly. Sadly, maybe that's not a good thing. All right, why don't we take till 45? It's 2:25. We'll take until 2:45. Come on back in 20 minutes. I know it's hard to get to Hub because they've closed off the tunnel or the walkway that goes there. So yeah, go get a coffee, come back in 20 or so minutes, and we'll talk about Gen X and all that jazz. Turn you off. Okay, let's jump in here. We'll do a little bit more, and then let you go for, I guess, the weekend. It feels weird to say that on Wednesday. All right. So, Gen X. All right, so Gen X is this weird generation. It's a relatively small generational cohort as compared to the baby boomers, right? It corresponds roughly to this decline in total fertility rate. That's kind of the years where they start being born. It's around the time that TFR essentially starts to drop off. So Twenge has them, kind of between 1965 and 1979. I've seen alternate dating, putting them as early as 1962. Or 1963, but 1965 seems like a perfectly fair one. And basically ending, 1979, so just prior to the beginning of the 1980s. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, we think of the silence as a forgotten generation. Gen X is also a little bit of a forgotten generation too, overshadowed by particularly the baby boomers that came before them, and then the millennials that came after them. And we'll talk about the millennials. The millennials are a really good time. But yeah, we know a lot about them, and Gen X just doesn't get talked about nearly as much. Okay, so Gen X is born into a slightly different technological environment than the baby boomers were. For them, they are the first to experience television basically for the entirety of the cohort, right? So some of the, the baby boomers, they would have gotten television when they were really, really young, maybe in the 1950s, when they were 9 or 10, if you're in the older part of kind of the baby boom. Gen X, right, by the time Gen X hits in the mid-60s, television is pervasive, and it starts to expand, right? You start to get, the beginning of cable television, although it's just starting for Gen X. So prior to that, everybody had 3 television channels. Gen X, you're going to start to see the proliferation and personalization of media a little bit more. Okay, Gen X, in lots of ways, we talk about it as being the last to have an analog rather than a digital childhood, right? So this is the last generation whose entire formative years are going to come prior to the internet becoming a household technology, right? So they're the last generation that experiences, the world in their childhood, right? Obviously, once they're adults, the internet comes and they all experience it. But in their childhoods, basically, they're too old to have had the internet being a really formative part of their young years. Okay, in terms of kind of shifts from, especially something like a duty-based culture or a culture that values duty to a more individualistic one, as a result of kind of the Vietnam War and all of the problems that come from it, the whole and a kind of declining need for kind of big conscript armies in the West in particular. The U.S. and then increasingly in different parts of the kind of the West or the developed world, increasingly this is the first generation that's not going to experience mandatory military service, or at least the possibility of mandatory military service when they are young. So it's for Gen X that conscription or the draft is abolished. Right now, again, this happens in different places at slightly different times. It happens about the same time in Canada, where you don't have to sign up for military service or to be potentially conscripted to military service. In France, it's not until I think 1996. But essentially, you get a movement of military forces to professional armies and away from people having to serve in the military for a couple of years. This is largely pushed by the counter-war movement against the Vietnam War, and the feeling and a kind of political motivation as the boomers become a really powerful demographic, that people don't want to have their lives upended by this kind of duty to their society, that if people want to serve in the military, that should be their choice rather than something that's kind of owed to your country, right? And you still see this, this notion, say in places like Israel, right? In Israel, every male serves at least 2 years, every woman serves 3 in the military, and it's thought of as a kind of duty to your country. That all kind of fades away in Canada and the US, and it becomes like a job, like a career path like any other, but one that should be entirely chosen. Okay, Gen X is also the generation that grows up, most at the kind of height of the Cold War, right? So you have the competition between the Soviet Union, the USSR, and the United States and kind of the Western Bloc and NATO being really at front and center of everybody's kind of consciousness, and especially following the space race. The Soviets get to space first, and then in the 60s, the U.S. puts a man on the moon. But along with that comes the development of really powerful and really prolific ballistic missile technology that would allow the Soviets or the Americans to launch nuclear missiles at each other, which raises the fear of a nuclear war between the two powers to an extreme. Okay, so it's a generation in that sense that's marked by a lot of anxiety about the state of the world, right? That the world could end at any time because of a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And just like as a comparison, right? Like if you talk about the millennials, and I'll say one word about them. The millennials, right? So born in two ends, right? Born the oldest of them in 1980. So in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses, they're still only 11, right? So the USSR, 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. So most of their adolescent years, especially when you be aware of politics for millennials, is in the post-Soviet period, right? So they're not as, I don't think, having grown up as a millennial, I don't think anyone was really worried about nuclear war until just recently. So for Gen X, this was kind of an omnipresent danger, right? There were school drills of what to do if the nuclear war happened, right? But for millennials, it passes. And for the boomers, because you didn't have intercontinental, long class, as you know, intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? The risk of nuclear war and of bombs being dropped on your head right away were much, much less than it would have been for Gen X. Okay, so compared to especially the generations that come after. So compared to the millennials and the Gen Z, it's a much more unified culture. While you start to get the emergence of technologies that will cause cultural fragmentation, it's not there yet, right? So amongst the kind of technologies that will end up causing cultural fragmentation is things like cable TV, which is just starting for Gen X, personal music players of various kinds, first analog and then digital ones. And then, of course, smartphones and the internet, right, which all cause us to consume different kinds of culture. For Gen X, right, they're probably the last generation that has a really unified sense of the culture. Because for most of them, right, if we talk about television, they're all watching, in the US, it would have been 3 channels. I won't write it down, I'll just tell you. It would have been 3 and then eventually 4 channels, right? So you would have had ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. And cable will expand the number of channels and the things you can watch. Eventually, it doesn't come until they're kind of a little bit later, until like the 1980s, and not everybody has it because it's super expensive. Everybody kind of listened to a lot of the same music, right? Everybody was listening to, the Rolling Stones and Madonna and these kinds of cultural icons. And it was a pretty unified culture because, there were fewer radio stations. FM was still, I know this sounds weird, FM was still a relatively expensive technology for broadcasting, right? So there were fewer FM stations. So you had like the top 40 station, a country station, and there's probably something else, like an easy listening station. But you didn't have a lot of choices, right? You start to get personalized media, but again, not until a little bit later for this generation in terms of things like cassettes, VCRs, personal cassette players. But in a lot of ways, everybody is consuming the same things, going to movie theaters, watching the same shows. And so everybody has a kind of unified sense of what's going on in the culture. And you have this sort of idea of like the water cooler culture where everybody on Monday morning or, in the morning gathers around to talk about what happened on the most recent episode of this evening soap opera, Dallas, because basically everybody was watching it. And that sort of starts to break down for millennials and Gen Z much more because you have more choices and then you can tailor things much more. Gen X, first generation, really to play video games in a substantial way, right? So this would have been, probably at first on, say, the Atari, and then the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. Eventually, Sega gets into the game, and you have the Sega Master Drive and the Sega Genesis. But the first generation for whom, first arcades, and then, home entertainment systems, home video game systems become kind of, not the norm because they're still pretty expensive, but they become possible. Okay, now, in terms of cultural traumas, this is the generation that experiences the high rates of divorce of the silent generation and their older baby boomer parents, right? So a lot of the silents that got married really young and were maybe having kids into the kind of, they're on the younger end of the silents into the beginning of the kind of Gen X generation, but especially kind of older baby boomers, they start to get divorced in much higher numbers. And, you'll have things like, I think it's 1985 in Canada or 1986, I can't remember which. You have the passage of an amendment to the Divorce Act, which makes no-fault divorce the norm. And you have similar things happening in the United States as well. And basically what this does is it shifts divorce from something where you had to prove cruelty or adultery to something where you just have to say, we don't want to be married anymore, right? You don't actually need to give a reason. This happens kind of in the middle part of the 1980s, and it increases the divorce rate for a while really, really massively. Okay, and they are, the first and somewhat the last of the latchkey kids, right? So what are latchkey kids? So basically, latchkey kids was this term that came out of kind of the experience of Gen X kids, where basically, because for the most part, their parents, their moms had returned to work, right, in really large numbers. So kids, relatively young, were walking home from school. They had a key to the family home, and they were letting themselves in. And then they had a whole bunch of time, typically at home alone, before their parents. Sorry, I just had a funny thought. Before their parents got home, right? So why are they the first? They're not really, right? This happened for the boomers as well to some extent, which is why I have sort of. So So there were earlier kind of versions of the latchkey kids, say, especially amongst the baby boomers, as their silent generation parents, to some extent, returned to work as well, or their silent generation moms returned to work as well. But you had a big kind of cluster of it as more women are moving into the workplace after their kids are in school. So more of the Gen X's parents are working, and so they're left to their own devices, after school. Now, why sort of the last of the latchkey kids potentially is because, certain problems sort of emerge, or a culture of what Jonathan Haidt will call safetyism, or real worries that people have that something bad is going to happen to their children. And so basically, once you get to millennials, you have the growth of kind of out of school care and after school programs for millennials, right? Not for Gen X. Gen X is still left alone, but it ends up being replaced with millennials. Less people come home on their own, and more people are in like fairly professionalized child care of some kind after school, because parents are worried. Okay, yes, I'm glad I had this on there. One of the weird things that happens with the latchkey kid phenomenon is it makes the age at which Gen X had sex for the first time considerably younger than it was for the baby boomers, and much younger than it will be for millennials and Gen Z. And why? I mean, amongst other things, should I read this? I should. Early boomers had sex, only about 2 years before they got married. Gen X women, on the other hand, went 7 years between losing their virginity and walking down the aisle. And principally what this was driven by was actually this latchkey phenomenon in some senses. So what would happen, right, in roughly junior high school, is people were coming home on their own, and they would have coupled up with someone, and because their parents weren't home, they would bring their boyfriend or girlfriend home with them. And as young people want to do when there's no supervision, they would then have sex with them. And so Gen X had this kind of weird experience. The latchkey phenomenon actually led them to having sex in a really relatively early. Okay, so this kind of leads Twenge to say, they followed the kind of normal life course, sense of marriage, sex, and children, though not necessarily in that order, right? For a lot of them, it was, sex, then children, then marriage, or some kind of combination of these things. Gen X's life in kind of social progression, it's very, very messy because the baby boomers destroyed the social script of the silent generation. Birth control made all sorts of things possible. The latchkey phenomenon gave them a bunch of unsupervised time. So all sorts of weird stuff happens. There's a lot of teen pregnancies amongst unplanned teen pregnancies and unmarried teen pregnancies amongst Gen X, which ends up causing a lot of problems. And the reason, there's still so much stress on pregnancy prevention and teen pregnancy prevention in sex ed programs today, even though teens' pregnancy rates have never been lower, is because of the experience of Gen X. Okay, so what Twenge will say, there's a flexibility in terms of sex lives and family life, right? And which order it progresses in, or whether people get married at all, or all of these sorts of things. And one of the things that happens, right, and like I said, because you have this latchkey phenomenon and people are having sex relatively early, what Twenge will say is that Gen X is actually marked by a relatively short childhood, right? Where people are kids for a really short amount of time, but a really long adolescence, right? So you'd mark, people being thought of as kids until like 11, 12, and then adolescent or sort of extended adolescence into their kind of 20s, right? Where they're potentially, say, sexually active, but not married and not having kids for a long time. But that period before they start having sex is relatively short compared to other generations. Okay. We start to see the age of first marriage rise for this generation, right? You saw where, if we talked about the silence, it rose with the baby boomers as well, but the silence, right, at its kind of lowest, women were getting married at about 20 years old, men 22, 23. With Gen X, it starts to shift in major ways in a kind of upward direction, right? And this is never going to reverse, right? Well, I shouldn't say never. It hasn't reversed since then. The age of first marriage is going to continue to rise for millennials and Gen Z. I think for millennials, on average, for men, it was about 29. For men, for women, somewhere around 26. And in Gen Z, we don't know because the whole cohort hasn't aged into adulthood yet. But it's looking like men is somewhere around 31, 32 age of first marriage, if they get married at all. Okay, and yeah, on the uncoupling of children from marriage, in 1960, 1 in 20 children were born to unwed mothers. By 1980, it's 1 in 6. And by 1993, it's fully a third of children are born to unwed mothers. And weird things, right? The age of the mother at birth, the first child, dipped below the age of first marriage for the first time, right? So people are getting pregnant and having kids before they get married. And this is the first cohort for which that is true. It's like when I put my thumb right there, it goes blank for a second. Or maybe it's just a coincidence. Okay. I wonder if is there anything else I should say about this generation in terms of that? That's probably enough. Okay. All right, so in terms of ideologies, something really weird happens for Gen X. So you remember a minute ago or before the break, I was talking about how the baby boomers, following their kind of wild years as hippies, smoking dope and having wild sex and all that fun stuff, kind of left that behind, got corporate, but then really leaned into the self-help culture. Well, they bring that into their child rearing and into the culture in major ways as well. So kids during this generation, right, are taught fundamentally that self-esteem is paramount, right? That and this would be the beginnings of, you would see like the origins of like Sesame Street in this era, and a real focus on kids believing that they are special in some way. Right, so in the early 1950s, we have fun things, right? Use of words in terms of self-focus and self-esteem in American books, 1950 to 29, or 2019, God. Okay, in the Google Books database, and you see, right, in 1950, no one is talking about self-esteem, and by the time you hit the early 2000s, right, it's gone up considerably. Okay. So, in 1950s, 12% of teens said, I am an important person. By the late 80s, 80% of teens, or more than 6 times as many, claimed that they were important. So I focus on self-worth, self-esteem, and all of these things. Again, coming out of that cultural movement that the baby boomers are kind of generating, they're passing it on to their kids in major ways. Now, this obviously, this actually keeps going in lots of ways because once we get to the millennials, they're even more focused on themselves to the point where Twenge will refer to them as Generation Me, or a generation experiencing a narcissism epidemic. And I'll show you, I think I have it in the slides here. She has like markers of narcissism in millennials is kind of crazy. Not to say bad things. Not to say bad things about my generational cohort, but there you have it. Okay. Okay, so in terms of their kind of life focus, one of the things that really takes over for Gen Z is materialism, and a sort of unabashed materialism, right? They want stuff. And so basically, the idea of what is it to live a good life goes from, questions of meaning, of virtue, of duty, of doing what you're supposed to do, towards, the one who dies with the most stuff wins, to put it in kind of quaint cultural terms, right? Or, as Twenge puts it, right, life goals for Gen X shift from intrinsic, right, meaning, ideas, helping others, what is the meaning of life, to extrinsic, right? So external, money, fame, images, or your image, right? And so, this is where you get this idea of, say, keeping up with the Joneses, right? That to live a good life is to have as much as your neighbors, and this kind of self-comparison culture, like I'm not doing as well as my neighbor because they have an Audi parked or BMW parked in the driveway, so I better go, get a second mortgage so I can afford that fancy car. One of the things that Twenge points to here is that, for Gen X, they undergo a big shift. Now again, it starts prior to them, but you see it's kind of dominant for them. What is the purpose of education, right? So why are they going to school? Or what are their goals in terms of what they want out of their college experience? If we go back to, the 1960s, 85% of the students in the 1960s, right? So these would have been this would have been the silents, and then, the baby boomers just after that. But basically, here 85% said that they were in college to develop, or one of their goals was to develop a meaningful philosophy of life, whereas, only about, let's say 42, 43% says it was to be well off financially. And by the time we get through Gen X, right, those have completely inverted, well, not completely to the same level, but basically about 75% of Gen Xers are in college so that they can be financially well off, versus, developing a meaningful philosophy of life, which drops into kind of the mid 40% range. Okay, so, excuse me. What does this mean? Well, it's a kind of cultural shift towards materialism in this case, which is kind of a form of individualism in terms of, what are you getting out of it in terms of financial rewards. And it's, university, college used to be thought of, and you still hear complaints about this from people, say, I hear this like when I listen in like the conservative podcast space here and there, where people complain that universities used to be about, connecting with the great tradition, right? With understanding Western civilization and, things like Shakespeare and the Iliad, reading Plato and Aristotle and these sorts of things. That's what the university used to be about, connecting with the tradition of your civilization and building a philosophy of life that was meaningful. Whereas it kind of shifts, right? Somewhere in the 1970s, and it's really firmly ensconced by the 1980s, you've essentially instrumentalized education, right? Education becomes about a job, right? It stops being about, civilizational goals or improving yourself so you can bring something to your community. It becomes about getting a job, right? A job that's going to allow you to get relatively wealthy or at least remain in the middle class, so that you can, acquire material things. And, this trend has just accelerated with millennials and Gen Z. Almost no one, now thinks about education as being about developing a meaningful philosophy of life. It's really now about acquisition. A question? I'm so happy. Yes, I would be happy to go back to the latchkey kid thing. Okay. Latchkey kids. So, a latchkey kid basically is a kid that comes home from school by themselves, right? So they let themselves into the house and there's no one there, right? So they're unlatching the door and letting themselves in because they have their own keys, right? It's kind of a weird term, but yeah, they were the kids that were unsupervised after school because mom was at work. And boy, again, it's hard. I think it's hard in some ways for us to imagine this, but boy, was there a cultural stigma against this, in that kind of Gen X generation, right? That mom had gone off to work and she was abandoning her kid at home, and that all of it, especially when you combined it with this notion at one point that kids were being fed. Mom wasn't home to even cook, that she was feeding her kids prepackaged food in the form of TV dinners, which are like microwavable dinners, like Hungry Man or whatever. I think they're still around. Right? Because she wasn't doing her domestic stuff. She was off working and having a career. There was a lot of guilt associated with that in the 1970s. But yeah, latchkey kids that basically came home and were home alone for some period before their parents came home from work. So they were unsupervised for long periods of time. I don't know what it is. Maybe I develop an electrical charge as I pace and then I discharge. I don't know. Okay, thanks for the question. Very nice. Okay. All right, so Gen X's mental health. Gen X seems to have had a pretty troubled adolescence, and kind of relatively better mental health as adults. Okay, so if we look at percent of adults with depression, 2005 to 2020, right? We see basically Gen X relatively, in terms of when they're in their 40s, right? They went down, but they were kind of going up, while they were in their kind of early, emerging adult years. So basically, okay, what does this chart show? In the teen years, they were a little bit more depressed. They were struggling a little bit more. As they got older, things got a little bit better. Now, I mean, the millennials were, in this transition from Gen X to millennials were way more depressed than pretty much anybody else up to that point, except for, I guess, the boomers. So bad news for the millennials. So Gen X kind of saw this rising tide of depression, and very troublingly, when they were teens, nearly double the teen suicide rate compared with boomers. As they've gotten older, though, and into adult, proper adulthood, and into kind of middle age, their mental health is actually better than say the baby boomers. Okay, I should say this number comes with a bit of nuance because it's a little bit of a weird number. What seems to have happened here is that this spike in teen suicides amongst Gen X happened roughly at the same time as a whole bunch of kind of, this is the US, it doesn't happen in Canada, right? If we look at Canada, we look at Britain, that didn't happen. And the reason seems to be in the US that it corresponded with the loosening of gun laws in the US in that particular period when Gen X was in their adolescence. And so a lot more of the young people who were attempting suicide in this period seem to have been successful because they were able to get their hands on guns, right? So you want to put it with a little nuance. That number might actually not point as strongly to really negative mental health as it might seem on the surface. All right. Okay. So something that's going to become really important as we go through the course, because this is going to carry on for millennials and Gen Z as well. Gen X is a generation that basically was categorized by kaboom. Gen X was categorized by kaboom. No, sorry, a decline in kind of trust in institutions, right? And social trust in general. Okay, so what do I have on my graphs here? So if we look, this is from a great study. And if you've taken any classes with me, I love monitoring the future, which is this study that's been running in the US from 1976, and it continues to run today, where they basically survey, young people every year, and kind of, so you can look back on this data and compare, kind of year by year. Okay, so we see in the monitoring the future data, so US 12th graders expressing trust in others, thinking that others are helpful, that they trust them, and that, ultimately life is kind of fair or society's fair. So if we go back into kind of the, the baby boomers, relatively good numbers here. Starts out okay for Gen X, and then all of these markers, drop off considerably. Similar story, 12th graders expressing trust in government. I say people just got smart. But right, we see declining trust in government, that government is run for the people versus for big interests, right? All of these things kind of decline from highs in 1976-ish I guess the high here is the start of the Gen X, and decline, through Gen X, rise up a little bit for millennials, and then drop off again for all of them, right? So basically, Gen X is the beginning of this thing where people start to say, we don't trust, government's, not for us, it's not for the people, it's for some kind of big interest. And the people, not surprisingly, this bottom line was always the lowest, but it should be even lower than that. People running the government are honest. I chuckle. Have I told you I hate everyone? I hate everyone. Everyone in government, they're all weirdos. Okay. Sorry. They're all weird. I'm sorry. You have to be to put yourself under that much scrutiny. All right, and the last one, income inequality and lack of trust. So what we see basically is a rise for Gen X, kind of what I said earlier, right, is that basically the silence and then the boomers experience some of the lowest kind of inequality in terms of income inequality of any generation. What happens with Gen X, though, is income inequality starts to rise substantially. So there's a bunch of things happening at the end of the 1960s that sort of lead to this. So this prolonged economic boom in the United States that had run 1945 until my daughter has sent me a sad face. Oh dear. Her favorite water bottle broke. I think she'll be okay. I thought it was something serious. It is not. 14. To be 14 again. Never. Okay, so from 45 till about 1970, the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, it's gangbusters for the economy, right? The middle class, the working class are doing the best they're ever going to do, and that income inequality is the lowest it's ever going to be in North America, right? The difference between the really rich and the kind of average is relatively low. What happens after that, though, is the U.S. falls into this period called stagflation. Too much social spending, right? Government spending too much money causes basically inflation to go crazy, right? Prices start to rise. And so what does the government do is they increase interest rates, basically to kind of cool down the economy a little bit and to cut social spending. Coupled with the fact that there's what's called the Arab oil embargo in 1973, where OPEC and a bunch of Middle Eastern oil producing states basically to punish the US for supporting Israel put on a sort of embargo. So they cut the amount of oil that they're shipping. It causes the price of oil to shoot up sky high. So you have a bunch of things driving inflation, too much government spending, and then high energy prices. Sounds like today. Weird how that happens. Maybe time is cyclical. So too much government spending, high energy prices cause basically a ton of inflation. The government responds by jacking up interest rates. You think it's bad today at 5%. You were talking in some places as high as 20% interest rates. So basically the economy grinds to a screeching halt in the my parents recall, they always tell the story that the first house they bought on their mortgage, they were paying a 22% interest rate, and they got to the end of their first 5-year kind of commitment. And I mean, mortgages were not the size they are today, but they had paid off something like $200, and everything else they had paid was interest. So they basically borrowed money from my grandparents, who had just sold their farm in northern Alberta, paid off their mortgage, and then eventually paid my grandparents back interest-free. Because they were like, yeah, we are never going to make it out of this hole. So huge interest rates, and the economy kind of grinds to an absolute halt. So what happens, right, income inequality starts to really climb. The wealthy continue to do well because the wealthy never really suffer. But the working and middle class, right, their kind of standard of living starts to kind of cool off. Wage growth really slows. A lot more of them end up unemployed. What happens after that, right, when we get to about here, 1980, sorry, I circled that badly. Then you get, how to put this, I guess we'll put it this way. You get the rise of neoliberalism or neoclassical economics, right? So pushed by people like Milton Friedman at University of Chicago, conservative politicians like Ronald Reagan in the US, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and Brian Mulroney in Canada decide that the solution to the problems of the economy are essentially to deregulate the state, push back against unions in particular. This is a big thing that both Thatcher and Reagan do. Deunionize the economy, so make workers' rights less paramount, and basically cut taxes. So the rich, get much richer. So this is why this line climbs up like this. Income inequality gets much worse. Now, typically what happens when income inequality is getting worse is people trust society less, right? There tends to be a lack of trust in all sorts of kind of social institutions. The government, I guess I'm example A because I've told you multiple times that I hate everyone in politics. So I don't trust the government in the slightest. Or my maxim is the government sucks at everything, only because my dad worked for the government for 35 years and literally told me almost every day that the government sucks at everything. So apparently that stuck. So the government sucks at everything, but basically less social trust, less belief that you're going to be able to get ahead, right? More belief that the whole way society is structured is for the benefit of some kind of elites. And we see that growing over time, right? Starts with Gen X as their economic opportunities get worse, and it's just going to continue, right, for millennials as well. Okay, how are we doing? Good? We're almost done for today. All right, we'll do a few things. It's a little bit too early for me to let you go 20 minutes early, but maybe we'll do a few more minutes, and then I will let you go. So that's Gen X in a nutshell, right? Gen X, oh yeah, sorry, please. I love questions. Happy.
So trust in the government remains?
The declines, right?
Okay, it's high on the...
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, relatively high compared to where it will be for millennials and Gen Z, right? That's going to get, sorry, that's a good question. It remains relatively high compared to, right, so trust in government, right? For some part of it remains relatively high. Coming out, it kind of goes back up, and then it'll drop considerably compared to where it will go later. There's a weird split too. Liberals, will trust government more than conservatives do, which seems to be a pretty normal thing. But yeah, it remains relatively high compared to some other social institutions, particularly media, banks. People hate them. Public education, religion. Those institutions decline faster than, say, government does. But then, yeah, even compared to where it'll be for millennials, it stays somewhat higher. And then millennials and Gen Z start to hate the government too. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else I should say about Gen X? I think I've said everything there is to say. It's millennials. Okay. So millennials are kind of a long one. I know, you're like, these other ones were short. I am sorry. But I think it's interesting. Millennials are a really interesting cohort because they sort of come at a confluence, especially in the US context, where a focus on researching young people grows considerably. So when it comes to millennials and Gen Z, we just have garbage trucks full of data to talk about when it comes to these generational cohorts. I think we know more about the lives of millennials, and this is why for me, a lot of this course, we'll talk about the millennials a lot in different contexts because we have so much data on what their lives have looked like, right? Even compared to the boomers, right? We have pretty robust data on the boomers in some ways, but nothing compared to, and Gen X, but nothing compared to what we know about the millennials, and nothing compared to what we'll know about Gen Z, because there are so many of these like long-term social science studies that have been asking questions since about the 1970s, right about when, just before the first millennials are born. Okay, so millennials, despite what my sister wants to tell me, because she wants to say millennials start in 1981 because she doesn't want to be included, and I'm like, too bad. You're a millennial whether you like it or not. And then my one friend, Paige, who is one of my favorite people in the world, she was complaining about, she's a manager at an engineering company in Calgary, and she was complaining, it's like, I hate millennials. And I'm like, She's a year younger than me. So she's born in 1983. I'm like, Paige, I hate to tell you this. You are a millennial. I think her response was, I don't care for that at all. Okay, the millennials, right? Born 1980 to 1994, roughly speaking. Again, okay, so what are they marked by? So, this thing that starts with the boomers, right, and then picks up in Gen X, really finds its apogee in millennials in lots of ways, right? Self-expression and the idea that the only person you need to impress is yourself. This is a trademark of millennials, right? It's all about me, me, me. Love yourself, right? Assert yourself, love yourself. Self-gratification, self-esteem, and self-expression, according to Twinkie, gives rise to a generation of narcissists. And here she has her handy graph from Generations, right? Markers of narcissism, right? Narcissistic personality inventory of U.S. college students. The gray is millennials. And as you see, in 2000, 2004, by the way, this is when I was doing my undergrad, so hello. Am I a narcissist? Maybe. Maybe that's why I'm like talking to people. Kind of hit at an all-time high for this particular study amongst millennials, right? The markers of kind of narcissistic personality kind of hit their peak with millennials. So, not a very nice thing to say, but I guess it might be true. The empowered self, right? A firm belief that your dreams can become reality. And I'll talk about this in a minute. The millennials, weirdly, they'd been told, especially by their kind of boomer and kind of early Gen X parents, that you can be whatever you want to be, right? That you should dream big, that you can be whatever you want to be. And it really did impact millennials in a considerable way, right? They're a very optimistic generation, right? A generation that really believes that the future is bright, or did, especially when they were adolescents. However, they're also the first generation, or a generation that saw a marked rise in stress, anxiety, and depression. Suicide, so along with, according to Twinkie, along with the being self-focused, came some pretty big problems, including a lot of loneliness and a culture that really stressed hard work and standing on your own 2 feet or standing alone. Okay. So, kind of along this same trajectory, right? Of like lack of trust, a lack of trust in institutions and the kind of system. Millennials experienced a rise in apathy, right? A declining belief that hard work and sacrifice combined with fading confidence in the power of collective action, right? So they started to believe that the world couldn't really change, right? That basically activism was pointless, that you couldn't really change the world. And so the millennials, on the whole, politically, were a very passive political generation, right? They didn't want to, so let's say, I'll put it to you this way. Participation in things like political parties declines sharply amongst millennials compared to older generations. They simply didn't believe that participating in things like collective action, charity, NGOs really had a purpose, right? That basically you couldn't change the world, so why even bother, right? So, I'll talk about that in a minute. A sense of the common good, what is the common good, or even a definition of what they should be striving for, was not something that the millennials really had. Okay. Kind of along with Gen X, millennials became sexually active way earlier than the boomers, and that big gap between losing their virginity and when they would form families or get married was long for millennials as well. So they are in the same kind of space as Gen X in terms of early, like short childhood, long adolescence for the millennials. Now, this is made even more pronounced for millennials by a couple of things. The rise of, we'll talk about this later in the course, but of hookup culture. And of course, a stress culturally on sex, especially in those emerging adult years, as being something that is disconnected from emotion, right? So that you would sleep with people, but not people you were intending to form a relationship with, but you're just having sex. And along with that, and maybe driven by that in some ways, increasingly unfettered access to adult content, porn, right, via the internet. And this is, one of the, I guess, the really important markers of the millennials. The technology that probably, they don't experience it their whole lives, but it comes into their lives roughly around, I guess, 1995. So in 1995, the internet becomes a sort of commercial product, right? Something that the average homeowner, or family could purchase, right? And along with that, I saw a joke the other day. Someone, the designer of these new AI systems, generative AI, is talking like, just imagine what people could create using my new system. Oh, they made porn. Anytime a technological advance comes, some kind of adult content or pornography seems to follow very quickly. And very quickly, as the internet became popular, pornography on the internet became very, very popular as well, right? So, what is it? Avenue Q, this musical, Broadway musical, had a whole song, "The Internet is for Porn," and sadly, kind of true in some ways. Squeak. It's all good, no worries. Okay, and this one, really, really important. This, especially as they hit late adolescence and early kind of emerging adulthood, the millennials really turn away from prejudice, right? They abandon a lot of prejudices, especially around gender, race, and sexual orientation. So the boomers may have started the gay and lesbian rights movements. It's millennials, I think, that kind of finally fully embraced it, and for whom a lot of the remaining stigmas around being LGBTQ sort of disappeared, and where having a bias against LGBTQ people became unacceptable, right? It was still relatively acceptable for Gen X and the boomers, right? A lot of people still held kind of homophobic attitudes. Once you hit millennials and once they get into adulthood, it becomes very much verboten to be, homophobic. Okay. Could I go over the differences between high, middle, and low classes during decline in social trust? Yes, I can do that. Okay. Okay, so when we talk about kind of declining social trust, right? I'm trying to think if I know the statistics off the top of my head. It's most prominent, right, in kind of the middle and working classes, right? So in terms of like, if you want to like income distributions, I don't know the income distributions off the top of my head, but as this black number, maybe I'll erase. You went the wrong way, fool. I'll erase this a little bit. As this black line starts to rise, right, which is income inequality, the people who feel that most is obviously people in the middle class and the working class, right? And especially, where sometimes there's a little bit of an overlap between those, blue collar workers who are in the middle class. They tend to be the ones that see their wages stagnate the most, especially, when we hit kind of the Reagan era and beyond, right? So kind of past this point, and the real kind of deunionization of the working class economy. And it used to be something like, I want to say it was about 40% of blue collar jobs were unionized in the United States. And now I believe it's in the single digits, right? And unions do a lot of good things for especially working class people or blue collar people, is it tends to protect their interests and keep their wages relatively high. So, and it tends to get more of the, I don't want to sound like a Marxist, because I'm not, but the, excess value, right? Or surplus value. Surplus value is the Marxist term. So the profit that's generated from the creation and sale of products more of it goes towards the workers when workers are unionized in broad ways. So as the union movement and as kind of, especially conservatives and neoliberals in general kind of push back against unions as one of the causes of economic stagnation, there's a lot of reasons for this, which I can't tell you because it would take a whole other class. And no one wants to hear me talk about Toyota. But do you want to hear me talk about Toyota? Kind of? Okay. All right, so another thing that happened, something I didn't tell you that happened in the 1970s. So one of the big industries in the US has always been in manufacturing, right, is the auto industry. And through the kind of like 1940s to 1970s, the American auto industry essentially has no competition, right? They're making cars, pretty terrible ones, to be honest, very unsafe, gas-guzzling monstrosities, and because they're the only game in town, no one really cares. Right up until the 1970s. Because what happens is the Japanese basically spent from 1945 to roughly the end of the 1960s rebuilding their economy. And they founded a bunch of car companies, but most prominently Toyota and Honda. What happens in the 1970s is that Toyota and Honda enter the US market in major ways. They start selling a lot of cars, because their cars are really reliable, because of the way Toyota makes things. You have to come take work in industry with me, because we'll talk about, well, you don't have to, but you could. Aside from Japanese management, it actually is not the most exciting class, but they asked me to teach it, and I reluctantly said yes. But I was like, kind of a boring topic, but I've taught it before. The Japanese make things in a really interesting way, and they give workers a lot of agency to stop things when they see problems. So Japanese cars have always had really high quality compared to their American counterparts. And because they're really good on gas and the price of gas goes absolutely crazy in the 1970s, people start buying a lot of Japanese cars. And this just guts the American auto industry, right? And so a lot of what happens is this is blamed on the unions, right? The unions are blamed for making American car makers too expensive. Therefore, they can't make safe cars or reliable cars because they're investing too much in worker wages and not enough in engineering. And then you start to get this sort of clawback against the union movement as making, again, it's all Toyota's fault for making amazing cars. But it basically starts to chew away at the union movement because there becomes more of an emphasis on actually unions are not good for workers. They actually hurt workers because they're going to end up costing you your job when the Japanese come in and sell things that are much higher quality at roughly even prices. So it really kind of hampers the union movement and gives kind of ammo to people like Reagan and to a lesser extent Thatcher and Mulroney, who are like, we need to sort of make it harder for unions to get established. And so you get a bunch of anti-union laws, especially in conservative jurisdictions. Like in the south of the US, you end up with what are called work to rule laws, or I can't remember what they're called now. It's escaping me. But where basically you don't have to join a union even if you work in a union kind of workplace. So that's a really interesting question. But yeah, so I'll try to finish answering it. I went off on a tangent about Toyota because you asked me to. Just remember that. So as they experience more inequality, right? Working class and kind of blue collar job wages really, really stagnate, which causes them to sort of, in some cases, fall out of the middle class, which makes them more resentful and leads to these kinds of attitudes that, hey, the government isn't actually working for us. It's working for these big corporations. Because as you see the emergence of kind of super billionaires, right, the precursors of like Elon Musk, there's lots of them, and they're doing really well and you're not, people start to believe that government is serving their interests and not yours. And as that kind of creeps up, right, as the middle class starts to struggle more and more, welcome to 2024, people start to lose trust because they start to think the government is more against them and serving the interests of the powerful, right? You start to get things like the Loblaws boycott coming out of these things. It's like government is in the pocket of Loblaws, which maybe they are. I don't know. Maybe that's why my eggs cost me $8. They're not even organic. They're just regular eggs. All right, I broke it again. Just that spot. All right, we're at I could talk for 5 more minutes, but I'm sure you would like me to stop talking now. You don't have to nod. I won't look, but you can if you want. So why don't we leave it there? We'll pick it up on Monday. We'll finish up talking about millennials and Gen Z, and then we'll. I got some stuff to talk about education or families and education. So it should be fun. Those units are a bit briefer though. All right, we'll see you on Monday.